They also say that China, in this pursuit, they sometimes act very aggressive and far-reaching. Have you found that in your research to be true, that they're more aggressive than, say, American companies or other multinationals?
I don't really know that they're more aggressive necessarily. I think, frankly, what we've seen is, this very fast rise over the past 10 years of Chinese outward expansion and search for resources as the Chinese economy has been growing, at a rate of 9 to 10% per year, right, until very recently, 2 years ago. It dropped a little bit. But so I think there's this sense somehow that they are everywhere and doing everything in ways that are very different from what previous companies have done. But I think with the exception of sort of the different tools that I outlined at the outset, I think we find that Chinese companies, as Mike mentioned, behave in similar ways in terms of bringing resources, online into the global market. Sometimes not so much. For example, soybean is different. What they bring online for soybeans, they take home. But I do think that this sense of China, as this cookie monster of resources, is somewhat overblown. We also discovered, I think, to our collective surprise, that when you look, for example, at China's investment in land overseas, it is the third largest investor. It's not the first largest investor. The largest is Canada. The second is the United States. If you look at its investment in Africa, it's the fourth largest investor, right, after the EU and the United States, and I think Malaysia has now moved into third place. So again, the picture is much more nuanced, and we really need to look closely at what China is actually doing rather than simply accepting a lot of the hype that has surrounded its activities.
When you say you have to look at what they're actually doing, do you think they behave differently than other multinationals, like in Africa or in Latin America, in some ways?
In the governance areas, when we're talking about things like the environment or labor or sort of corruption issues, transparency, certainly we see some differences. And I think the easiest way to understand it is simply to look at the way that Chinese officials and Chinese businesses behave at home, because that's pretty much the way they behave when they go abroad. So if they're not undertaking environmental impact assessments at home, which oftentimes they don't, they're not doing them in Zambia, or sometimes they are, but not as often as they might.
So this leaves a trail of corruption and violations, which they...
Absolutely. I mean, I think you can look, and it's not just Africa, and I think that's also important in our book, that this is not all about China and Africa. That story has been exhaustively, I think, explored. But it's also China, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and we even looked at the United States, Canada, and Australia to get a different set of comparisons to understand, does China behave differently in the advanced industrialized countries from the developing countries?
One of the beliefs that's out there when it comes to how Chinese companies approach investment is that they're directed by the state, that they're called up and told, you do this, that, and the other. Now, occasionally they are called up and told, you do this, that, and the other. Sometimes they listen, sometimes they don't. But the more powerful direction that comes from the state comes through a set of incentives that is set up that encourages them more broadly. So a policy decision can be made to provide lower cost financing. And Liz talked about that early on. If you're investing in priority areas, once you do that, you don't need to tell a CEO to go after this particular resource. Their desire to turn a profit in will direct them toward the places where they can do better because of that financing edge. You don't need to tell a CEO who aspires to be promoted to a minister post in the government. Remember, these are people who are part of a political system that while they're out trying to make their profit, they should also be trying to rack up gains on the fronts that top Chinese political leaders are saying are priorities. And so these are the more subtle ways that the Chinese state influences behaviors of these companies, but I think they're frequently the more powerful ones.